All right. Thank you very much. Paul, do you want to say a word or two before I jump into the presentation?
Sure. First of all, John, thank you for your hospitality. It's great to be here with all of you, and Howard, great to be working with you again, especially in this new normal venue. Let me just make a couple of points. I've already sent out a chat to everyone. If you have any questions, points, commentary at all, please, by all means, post it in the chat box. I'll do my best to keep track of what you're saying and what you'd like to ask Howard. What we'll do is Howard will give a brief presentation here. I'll ask him a couple of questions to get us going, and I'll try to get through as many of your questions and comments as I can before we wrap up at the end of the hour. With that, Dr. Friedman, the floor is yours, sir. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for all the people who are joining online. I really appreciate you being able to participate in this event. So I'm going to start with a little overview of ultimate price, the value we place on life. And interestingly, the most common question I've gotten about the book is whether that's my head underneath the bag in the picture. So the answer to that question is no, because it doesn't show off my double chin. With that said, we'll move on to start talking about ultimate price. There are some key themes that come up, and one of the key themes is the fact that while we say all lives are precious, they're not priceless. And in fact, price tags are put on human lives at all times. They're put in from different perspectives and different purposes. Governments put in price tags. For-profit companies do. Civil courts put in price tags on human lives. Health insurance companies, life insurance companies. The important thing that I like to convey in the book is the idea that many of these price tags, they're conveyed in equations which can appear complicated, but we can all understand them. We don't have to be statisticians or health economists to understand them. Also, sometimes these equations are unfair. They leave some lives more vulnerable, less valued, and more susceptible to risks. So we need to understand when lives are being priced unfairly. And if so, we should challenge those actions. Today, of course, we're in the COVID world, and the inequalities we're seeing are rampant. We're seeing situations where individuals are being more exposed to the COVID virus, situations where individuals are having more substantial impact on their own economics, their own livelihood. We're also seeing some lives more valued than others in terms of who receives the limited amount of COVID tests that are available. I think many of us recall early March when Tom Hanks was reported to have been COVID positive, and when NBA players were reported COVID positive. But here in New York City, you couldn't get a test. Why? Some lives are more valued than others. I think that type of inequality is something that we need to understand and we need to challenge. Lastly, and I'm sure this is a topic we'll get into probably during the question and answer, is this whole question that keeps coming up of the balance of economics and human life. How do we think about that, especially in the question of reopening the economy? And the short answer is we have a framework for it. It's actually what the regulatory agencies do every single day. The problem is the situation is much bigger now, and there's so much more uncertainty than what a regulatory agency is used to handling. So with that said, I want to reiterate a point that I raised, which is price tags are put on our lives all the time. I describe here arbitrators. So if you have a court case and you have someone making a judgment on it, they might have to put a price tag on a human life. It's quite common in civil courts to have to decide what is the payment for a wrongful death. Regulators use values of human life routinely as part of their work. They use something called the value of a statistical life to decide whether the value in terms of the lives saved from a new regulation is worth the costs. Of course, this is a basic part of any for-profit company that presents any risks to their customers. And so it's numerous, and we have to realize that they will have substantial impacts on our lives. Here's a brutal example I put up of an extreme case. A situation where one young person is given a low value of life, $250,000, whereas someone else who's the CEO of a company is given a much higher price tag. Now that might sound theoretical, And these numbers might sound theoretical, but they're actually based on true history. They're based on the real world of what happened in the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Following September 11th, the government assigned a certain amount of money, and they put Special Master Kenneth Feinberg in charge of allocating money to be paid to the families of the victims, and they had to promise to not sue the airlines. The whole creation of the fund was controversial. A lot of people thought it shouldn't exist, but it did exist. A lot of people also were very upset about how the calculation was done. Now, Kenneth Feinberg was given a constraint by the Congress. He was told he had to consider economic costs. That's sort of how civil courts have to take into consideration the impact economically to a family. His calculation put a minimum value of life. He said no matter who that person is, no matter what they were earning, at least they had to be valued $250,000. He also capped the incomes. He said if you were earning millions, I'm not going to put that in my equation. I'm going to cap it at $200,000 or a little bit more than $200,000. He added some extra factors for the number of dependents. In the end, the lowest payout was $250,000. The highest payout was over $7 million. And in fact, the absolute top payout was not for a death, but for an injury. Well, this opens up the question of why. Why was there such a huge range? In this particular case, that 30x range between the lowest and the highest amount for death was due to one simple factor, income. Now, you might think, well, this is tremendous, but the reality is, had he not taken such pains to control the difference in incomes, it would have been much worse. What do I mean by that? Well, the reality is, in the United States, we have some of the highest income inequality of any wealthy country in the world. In the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund, Kenneth Feinberg recognized the limitations in these calculations. He himself, within a few years afterwards, even stated that if he had the opportunity to do it over again without constraints, he would have valued all lives equally. He felt it was unfair. He thought it was more difficult to manage as a fund, and it would have been much less controversial. Like I said, a lot of people were not happy with this fund. They thought it was unfair. Income as a basis for valuing human life has a lot of problems. The problems stem, one, from biases. It's well established that there are gender pay gaps, racial pay gaps, age biases, location biases. So if you base the value of the human life on how much they earn and don't adjust for all these biases, you're being vastly unfair to that person. That's an issue. There's also the reality of some people choose to spend their time as caregivers, perhaps for elderly parents, perhaps for younger children. They've made a choice. Why should that value of that life be considered less simply because they've chosen to spend time giving to others? Others choose professions which require advanced education but don't pay much. Should that person be punished or the families be punished by valuing their lives less? So whenever we think of income as the basis of valuing human life, there are a lot of intrinsic issues that we have to recognize, and a fair system would adjust. We have to reflect on the United States, and our tremendous income inequality means that if we just used income as a basis to value human life, the primary driver that was used in the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund, you would come up with conclusions that make no sense. You would draw the conclusion that one successful hedge fund manager is more valuable than hundreds of police, teachers, social workers, soldiers. You would also draw the false conclusion that income itself is a reflection of how valuable a human being is. These are problems. The income range in the United States is enormous. And I think we have to appreciate that this is really not the norm if you compare to other countries. Our minimum wage is much, much lower than other wealthy countries, so that if you were earning minimum wage, that comes out to about $15,000 a year annually, assuming you work a 40-hour week. At the same time, some leaders in the financial industry make hundreds of thousands of dollars. Certainly, we couldn't sit there and say that those financial leaders are worth thousands of times more than that human being. It also reflects something that's missing, and it's missing the broader perspective. The broader perspective of the other factors besides income that are important. And this is why Kenneth Feinberg, when he did his work, he insisted on a minimum value. He said, no matter who you are, there'll be a minimum number. And he capped the salaries. He didn't allow for people to have reported incomes of millions of dollars used in the calculation. Income itself in the United States really is an unusual situation versus other countries. The ratio of CEO pay to typical worker pay in the United States is much, much higher than other wealthy countries, and it's actually much, much higher than historical US ratios. If you go back to the 1970s, the ratio was somewhere around 30 or 40 to 1, which is about the same ratio as Kenneth Feinberg produced in his analysis. In the book, I walk systematically through different concepts of how you value life. I start with the September 11 Victims' Compensation Fund, and I start by talking about this series of fictitious lives. And I talk specifically about a set of lives who have different aspects. Some of them are very wealthy, some of them are not. Some of them are workers, some of them are not. I then talk about the civil court system. And in the civil court system, it should have some reflection of income, but it doesn't always. I talk about justice, criminal justice. And in criminal justice, the interesting thing about that is justice is supposed to be blind. And it's in fact the scales I show here, yet the reality is that justice is not blind. And we are generally aware of the fact that while on paper all lives are created equally, in practice it's not true. I'm going to talk to you about a case that you may not have heard of. I think most of you are aware of O.J. Simpson. So I'm going to talk about Cheryl Thurston. Cheryl Thurston was disabled. She was in a care facility in New York. She was required to have 24-hour care. Turned out that the care facility failed to do their job. They left her in a bathtub. She slipped into a coma. She died within 24 hours. Her sister took the care facility to court, suing them. Now, in this particular case, the judge found the care facility negligent. There was no question that her death was due to the care facility failing to do their job. But the judgment was for $0. And the judgment was for $0 because of a few reasons. The first one was that Cheryl was not earning an income, she was costing money. The second was that, according to state law, she had not suffered pain because she never woke up. But the other point that played into this was that in New York State, there is no intrinsic value for human life. Just simply the fact that she was a human being that died did not play into the equations. As a result, the judge issued a $0 award conclusion, and in her judgment actually even stated that had Cheryl been chattel, like a cow or a chicken, then her sister would have been entitled to some payment. It was a dramatic demonstration of the failure of our court system. Cheryl Thurston dies, her sister is awarded $0. On the other side, we have an example from the O.J. Simpson civil trial settlement, a settlement of over $33 million. Now, the fame played into that case and the settlement. The wealth of O.J. Simpson played into that settlement. But a theme that comes up persistently in my book is the idea that lives that are less valued are less protected, and lives that are more valued are more protected. Imagine yourself. You're in New York State, and you're running a care facility. What message did the court just send to you? What message did they just send about the price that you will have to pay if you're negligent in caring for someone and they die in your care? Exactly. They sent the message that you may not have to worry so much. This is a huge problem. Now, it should be stated that state laws vary and that different factors play into the judgments in different states. But certainly in New York State, there is no intrinsic value for human life. If there had been, there would have been at least some award for causing the death of Cheryl Thurston. And here I have the exact quote, and it's very explicit. It basically says, "The scandalous irony had Cheryl been chattel that the claimant could have recovered? It's an incredible thought, and you have to take it personally. The book has a lot of concepts which seem a little bit abstract, and then there are things that impact you. One thing that impacts us is starting to think about life insurance. How much do I have to insure my own life for? But another thing is thinking about how well protected are you? And is the state motivating companies to protect you better or not? The theme will come up over and over. Lives that are more valued and more protected. Justice is supposed to be blind, but is it? It's clear when you look at the data that justice is not blind. The race of the victim plays a major role in the application of the death penalty. Should it? Of course not. But the data is quite clear that the death penalty is more likely to be applied when the murder victims are white and the murderer is black. This is a critical issue because it speaks to the unfairness of the system. Again, lives that are less valued are less protected. I find it, as a statistician, easier to think about situations where the data should be random. After all, we know that life sentences and capital punishment depend on the state itself. It's illegal in some states like New York, and it's legal in states like Texas. But if we think about a process that's more random, like vehicular manslaughter, you're driving your car, you unfortunately run someone over, they die. You had no intention of causing the damage, but someone died. The punishments should be somewhat random. Who the victim is should not actually impact the jail sentencing. But the simple fact remains that, on average, the jail sentences are shorter if the victim was black, male, or unemployed. Again, lives that are less valued are less protected. In this case, less protected by our criminal justice system. When we think about these price tags, it's important to recognize that businesses put price tags on human life all the time. If you are a company and you have any consumer product that could cause risk to the consumer, then there's someone doing a calculation. The calculation involves figuring out, is it worth investing more in safety? And if you invest more in safety to make the device safer, what is the benefit? And in that calculation, their benefits are about things like, how much will the company lose in civil court? How much will they pay in regulatory fines? As well as brand. And brand's an interesting concept because if you make a terrible decision as a company, you may be paying for that for decades and decades later. And if you make a good decision, maybe you receive that benefit for decades and decades later. This idea that companies are putting price tags on human life, it's not theoretical. It's happening all the time. And it's worth thinking about how this affects us. I'm going to take two extreme examples to give you a flavor for this. One example is Union Carbide. And some of you may recall a terrible accident in Bhopal, India in 1984. About 4,000 people died. 1989, the settlement is finally reached. And the settlement was for $60,000 per death. Now, this was 1989, so I'm tracking back in history. And this took place in India. The company, though, was an American company. It was Dow. In our particular case, I contrast it with a very recent situation, the Toyota car acceleration failures. This is only in the last few years. Toyota was well aware of a problem with their acceleration system. It was well documented. A choice was made. I'm certain it was an informed choice. Choice was made to not make the repairs, but rather to let the cars continue as they are. And the company would pay later fines, and they would later pay out in civil court. And as I state, probably pay some price in the brand as well. Well, as it turned out, less than 100 people died. The settlement came out to approximately $20 million per victim. Now, this was only a few years ago, and it was in the United States. So when you look at those two price tags, factors that are playing into it are the location. In the United States, we have far better protections when an accidental death happens. Time plays into it. It's a much more recent case, the Toyota acceleration case. But think about the message that's been sent. If you're a car company and you're debating whether or not you want to make your car safer, and you do your cost-benefit analysis to decide, am I going to invest more in safety or not? Well, if you insert $20 million per preventable death, it's going to really encourage you to make your car a lot safer. If you have to put in a value of $60,000, you're probably not going to worry too much. And this is how these price tags play a role in our day-to-day lives. The more valuable the value of a human life, the more likely that car company will be incented to make it safer. It's important to reflect on the fact that if you price lives fairly, human rights and lives are protected. And this is a concept that comes out in different aspects of the book. In healthcare, where we're trying to make sure that people have enough health so that they can get the opportunity to live. It comes out in areas of safety and regulations as well. Regulations is an interesting area. It's a part of our government that focuses on keeping people safe, but balancing it with the costs of that safety. Regulatory agencies, they balance it in a very interesting way, and we'll get to that in a second. But I want to offer you a thought here. Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan had a beautiful statement when their first child was born. They described in an open letter how it meant to them. And they formed a company that is meant to be dedicated to helping others. In that open letter, they stated, "We believe all lives have equal value." Now, it's easy to word parse this, to challenge that notion. After all, we know that they're not going to give as much money to an anonymous child in some other part of the world than to their own child. But let's take that sentiment at face value for now. Take the sentiment that all lives have equal value. And if we work through what that means, it means a world where people are more protected. And not surprisingly, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have a similar phrase. They say, "We see equal value in all lives." Again, this idea of equality. And I recognize the irony of having some of the richest people in the world talking about equality. But let's take that for now. Let's absorb it. Because I think that eloquent words can be supported with concrete action. And I want to describe for a second how our regulatory agencies work. So regulatory agencies are tasked with controlling, for example, how much arsenic is allowed in our water, how much coal pollutants can come out of a factory. That's their job. And how they control it is they focus specifically on what are the costs associated with making something cleaner or safer, and what are the benefits? The benefits in terms of lives saved, reduced morbidity, mortality. That's their function. When they do this cost-benefit analysis, they put a dollar figure on the lives saved. That dollar figure varies a little bit across agency, but it's roughly about $10 million. The same for everyone. Rich or poor, old or young, wherever you live, it's the same value. It wasn't always the case, by the way. In the Bush Jr. administration, they tested the waters. They said, what if we value older lives less than younger lives? What about if we use that equation? The public was livid. They didn't accept that. They thought that this was horrendous. They called it a senior death discount. And after seeing the reaction of the public to that, regulators backed off. And to this day, they're going with the principle of all lives are equal. So it's not really a theoretical concept. It's really something that people can implement. We started by talking about the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund, and my book starts with it as well. And the book comes across and talks about many other different aspects of how human life is valued. But then I come back to this fund idea, because this is a direct valuation of human life. Now, as it turns out, following the Boston Marathon bombing, they created a fund. This was a private fund. There was no restrictions from the government about how the money should be allocated. The administrator of the fund was, again, Kenneth Feinberg. This was only a few years ago. When he had the opportunity to administer the money from the fund, he followed a simple principle. The families of the victims get paid the same. He did exactly what he said he wanted to do, what he felt was fairer, what he felt was less controversial, what was easier to administer. So, not a theoretical concept, this idea of equality. It can be played out. It was played out in the example of the Boston Marathon Victims' Compensation Fund. It played out very specifically every day in how regulatory agencies do their job. In talking about how human life is valued, there are so many different aspects and different perspectives. Victims' compensation funds are one extreme example. Civil courts are where this happens all the time. Negligent deaths, negligent injuries. You see this all the time. In the justice system, it's not about dollars, but it's about meeting justice for society. Yet all lives aren't valued equally. Regulatory agencies we've seen now accept the notion that all lives are valued equally, but they didn't always accept that notion. In the corporate world, the price tag on a human life impacts how much they invest in safety. Low price tags, they won't invest much. But when you're Toyota and you've just learned that you're going to pay $20 million per preventable death, you and every other car company has learned a lesson to invest in safety. Healthcare companies constantly have to make this decision of how to allocate resources. Which drugs do I put on formulary? Which procedures will I support? Which ones do I not? In the situation of life insurance, you have to think about that for yourself. How much do I want to insure my own life for? And that's an interesting point. If I start thinking about this question of how much do I want to insure my own life for, you start asking yourself, what is the value of my own life? What's the replacement value? It's very difficult to simply have a blanket statement about how to value human life. The situation matters. And I describe in Ultimate Price how those situations matter. I describe a lot of the limitations in the methods. I don't want people to throw up their hands and say these methods are all terrible. They all have limitations. That's just the truth. But also, I describe many of the issues with income-based valuations. If you're deriving the value of someone's life by how much they're worth in terms of dollars and cents, how much they earn, all the biases, and we came across that even in this discussion. I think the starting point should be equity and equality. We should try for fairness as a starting point. Perhaps we can't finish on that point, but we can at least start with that idea. I think you've met me before, so I'm going to pause at this point, and maybe we'll pass over to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard, for telling us about your research and about your book. And again, I invite anyone who's with us on the call to please, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and I'll do my best to feed all those to Howard in the remaining time that we have here, a little less than half an hour. But I just want to start off with a couple of questions for you, Howard, just in terms of reading your book and thinking about some of your own thoughts and the hypotheses you've put out. You mentioned what Ken Feinberg did as a special master, either with September 11th or then sort of how he changed his mind and thought about equity and equality when it came to the Boston Marathon bombing. Are there choices around this valuation function? Are there situations where there's preventable death, where we should think about one set of equations, or different situations where they should be different? Is there one sort of, as a statistician might say, some parsimonious solution to this, or are there a set of solutions that are dependent on context? And how do we parse that either individually or as a society? Because I may value my life one way, but I'm not sure I know how to value yours. So do I use a different model? What's the right process to think about?
It's a great question, Paul. I think it's important to recognize that each calculation has a different perspective. Perspective is for where are they looking from in terms of the costs and the benefits. And the different calculations have a different purpose. So when I'm a for-profit company and I'm doing that calculation, I'm looking about my private costs. What hits my bottom line? What is affecting me? And so I'm looking at the costs in terms of what I have to spend money on. The benefits could be the preventable deaths, and so I don't have to spend money on something else. It's very sector specific. The regulatory agencies have a different perspective. They look at it from society. It's much broader. And as a result, they're looking at all the factors that may influence the costs. And the benefits, that value of human life, it's quite high. It's based on something called the value of a statistical life. And at $10 million, it vastly exceeds what I think most of us could hope to earn in a lifetime. That said, that value, that high number, helps to protect lives because it forces a higher level of safety. So I do think it does depend on the application. That said, there are litmus tests. There are ways to ask yourself, is it fair? And there's a statistical way to do it, and then I kind of hark back a little bit to my undergrad. My undergrad was in physics, and in physics, you'd have an equation, and then what you do is you'd pull it to the extremes and ask, does it make sense? And if it breaks, if it doesn't make sense in the extremes, you have to ask why. And so when people are testing these equations, these calculations for how much a value of life is worth, I always say, pull it to the extreme and see, does it make any sense? Because if it doesn't make any sense in the extreme, then we have a problem. And the case in point would be civil court. So in the civil court example of Cheryl Thurston, what we saw was that her life was worth nothing. And why was it worth nothing? Because there was no minimum bound. There was nothing that would guarantee some value of her life. Kenneth Feinberg tried to address that by requiring a minimum value when he did the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund. And then he went even further when he did the Boston Marathon by just saying all lives are valued equally. He's not even going to deal with a minimum or a max. Everyone gets the same number.
No, thank you. That's helpful in terms of sort of the context. Let me just ask a couple of questions that I'm getting here on the chat. Obviously, with COVID-19, there's a lot of questions about values of lives, either individually or bundles. So certainly as people look at different socioeconomic groups. We also have former governors of the state where I live, which is New Jersey, talking about how we should be able to sacrifice a certain number of lives in order to reopen an economy for the greater good. So you start to hear a lot of people making these judgments around healthcare. Let me ask you one that just came through, and you talk about this in your book. Howard, can you talk about the difference between the value of life and the value of health? Sort of quality adjusted life year versus something else.
Sure.
You make the point in the chapter about healthcare, and especially with people thinking about COVID-19, value of life versus value of health. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any quick reactions?
Yeah.
Are they the same? Are they?
It's a great question, really, and it's a subtle question because, for example, in the book I talk about the choice of metric impacts whose life will you save. If as a society I'm trying to save the most lives while spending the least amount of money, that's different than if I'm trying to save the most life years, while saving the least amount of money, or saving the most quality adjusted life years while spending the least amount of money. Those are three totally different metrics there. And I know it sounds a little theoretical, but in the UK, for example, their answer is simple. Quality adjusted life year. That's the metric they look at. And that results in allocations of resources that are more likely to be for younger and healthier people. And this isn't theoretical. Massachusetts, a little over a month ago, issued an advisory. It wasn't a law, but it was an advisory to hospitals that in situations where they have to choose, I hate to call it the Sophie's choice, but if you're choosing which life to save, they advised that hospitals should consider life expectancy, that they should consider the comorbidities of the patients, and that in case of a tiebreaker, consider age. So that was the directive of the state itself. The goal is to not get into that situation, but it's clear that in some circumstances, it's happened. And if we don't manage the COVID crisis, it will continue to happen. This is part of the goal of keeping the curve somewhat flat, is to not overwhelm the system so you don't run into those cases. But if you do, states are making their own decisions. I should point out that the Affordable Care Act has a provision in it that specifically says that you cannot consider life expectancy in allocating healthcare resource use. And in fact, I talk about that a little bit in the book as well, because that was the upshot of all the death panel concerns back in the Obama administration.
Thanks, Howard. Let me just pivot a little bit in terms of we're thinking about values of lives, and let me pivot to the cost dimension. Question that came through on the chat is, interestingly, if you contrast what you just mentioned that happens in the UK to what happens here in the United States with the FDA, for example, as we think about cancer care or even developing vaccines for COVID, the FDA right now does not actually consider cost when approving a therapy. So if it's going to cost me, $1 million, hypothetically, to give you a cancer treatment that might extend your life 2 weeks or 2 months, and I'm making this up, it's interesting that that's not brought into consideration, and many pharmacoeconomists have argued that that actually creates ballooning costs. anything that I can do to extend your life a day, a week, a month, I can get that almost at any price. Do you have any comment on from the same sort of regulation angle, from the cost perspective, not just the valuation perspective?
It is a good point, and the FDA is looking at things like safety and efficacy, and those are their primary considerations. There is a mix of healthcare systems in the United States, so it's not as simple as, let's say, the UK system where they have their National Health Service, or a country where everyone is the healthcare is universal coverage and it's a universal payer system. So you've got the Germany Bismarck models. There's all different models that exist, but there is always going to be some rationing of resources. Every person cannot get every possible drug they want or procedure at any time. There's always going to be some rationing. You want the rationing to be intelligent. You want it to maximize, ideally, something while minimizing costs. That's really the question, is what am I trying to maximize? Now, in the United States, when we have for-profit companies, they're still, for-profit health insurance companies are making a decision on rationing. They're not approving everything. Some drugs are on formulary, some drugs are not. They have priorities as to what procedures they will approve and which ones they consider to be optional procedures, discretionary ones that someone will have to pay out of their pocket for. So certainly the private health insurance companies do that, but also Medicaid and Medicare, they're not covering every possible procedure as well. So these decisions are being made. It's just a question of, are they being made in a way that maximizes lives?
Thank you, Howard. Let me ask you another one here. We've talked about valuation. We've now talked about cost. Let's think about investment. So kind of flip this around a little bit. A question that came through from a participant out there. Let me just make sure I ask it fairly here. We've talked about price tags for compensating lives that have been lost. Can we flip that around and think about the price tags or the investment tags to make investments in certain populations, like childhood illnesses or elder care, early childhood support, if you think about Head Start and other, not necessarily public investments, but if we think about the valuation kind of on the back end, what about the front end investment sort of rationalization? Do you have thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting question, because what we're doing is we're broadening the conversation. Instead of talking about lives as in whether someone is alive or not, we broaden it to talking about the quality of the life. And there are a lot of calculations that are done to look at the returns on investment, the returns on investment for education, the returns on investment for health, for other aspects of life. They're not always easily comparable. And the reason why is you get into this challenge of scope. You have to decide, what are you including as in the scope of the costs and what do you include in the scope of the benefits? And it's very difficult to walk from one study in early education to one on tertiary education, and then compare that to one in a different domain, like health or safety or equality. Each one of these has calculations, and the analysis is done in this space. But what you'll often find is they have these benefit cost ratios. That's really just what is the value economically, the positive divided by the cost, that have huge ranges because the scopes are so different. So if there was really good consistency in how the calculations are done across these domains, I think it's a great conversation to have. I just don't see the consistency, at least not in the work that I've done.
To that point, another participant out there said that, of course, it does make sense to start with this whole notion of equality, but in the real world, as you pointed out through a lot of different case examples, it doesn't always work like that. To the point you just made about whether it's the investment or the cost angle, thinking about private organizations or even private or for-profit organizations or even not-for-profits, what should boards be thinking about, whether it's the board of Toyota or the board of a foundation? What should they be thinking about in terms of, well, we want it to be equal, but we know it's not, so how do we sort of calibrate to that as we lead through this, thinking of some of the corporate leaders we've got out there?
So it's a little tough for a corporation to take its mandate too far. For-profit companies have to stay in business. They stay in business by making money. So the board is usually focused on guiding them on how they stay profitable. And where the values of life come in that particular framework is really in focusing on, are they doing this analysis in a way that not only is logical and makes financial sense, but often they will challenge them on what we like to call the New York Times front page test, or the red face test, which is, if this story came out that you did this, you knew about it, and you didn't take an action, what would be the damage? That's the brand question. So let me take you back to a quick example so we can paint this well. A lot of the folks may be aware of a Ford Pinto case. It's pretty famous. It happened in the early 70s. Basically, Ford Pinto was about to be launched. Regulators were planning on changing the regulations, making it more safety standards. Ford certainly didn't want that. They wanted to launch their car. So as the launch is going on, Ford prepared a memo that they submitted to the regulators. That memo specifically tried to make the case that the costs of making their car safer was vastly, vastly more expensive than the value of the human lives that would be saved, the deaths prevented. Now, in this particular example, the cost-benefit analysis was submitted to the regulators. It eventually found its way to Mother Jones, who wrote a scathing article in 1977. The public was livid. Ford lost in civil courts much, much more than they ever anticipated in their calculations. It was shown that they had overestimated the cost of repairs. But more importantly, it's 2020, and we're still talking about the Ford Pinto ethical failures. And that's, I think, where boards play a role, is not just in the finances, but really trying to encourage companies to not become the textbook examples of ethical failures.
Thank you, Howard. Let's move to the domain of social impact, which is a topic I've seen from a couple of folks here in the chat. One mentions income is often associated with social impact. So because you spend a lot of time thinking about income as the key covariate. Someone who's paid more sometimes is able to bring more social benefit, perhaps, in the technology field. Is there a better way, or is there a better feature or better measure or yardstick to use around social benefit versus loss in terms of what someone's value added is, or what an organization's value added is?
So Kenneth Feinberg had tried to touch on this when he opened up the conversation on adding dependent values. And like I said, it was controversial. What he had done was, he said, and he had a particular number on it, he had $250,000 for every dependent that person was responsible for. I think that was his way of trying to acknowledge that whoever died had expenditures, but also to play into that idea of social benefit a little bit. The problem is, it gets quite ambiguous quickly. What I deem as a social benefit may not be as beneficial to someone else. And it's easier to think about this from our tax law. So right now, if you give a contribution to a particular charity or nonprofit organization, a certain amount is tax deductible. And that's true whether you're giving money to an organization that benefits the poorest, or if you're giving money to the opera. And I like the opera, but let's face facts. It doesn't actually necessarily keep as many people viable and alive as if you were giving money to an organization that helps keep people, fed, let's say, or keeping people, to be able to get their necessary life-saving medicines. A distinction about the value of those charitable contributions isn't really made. Each dollar is treated the same. So I think that the judgment comes in and it becomes a very personal decision. I would say, instead of trying to have tailored factors, maybe we do have to at least start with the idea of equality. And then I said it's a starting point, and then we move around. So let me offer the failure of it. I said start with it, but I don't think you can finish with equality. Why? Because if I say that the person who's committed multiple murders has an equal value of life to the Nobel Peace Prize winner, well, that just seems like a strange judgment. It doesn't seem logical. And then there's the other thing that will always come up. We talk about it a little bit in the last chapter of my book, cognitive biases. But basically, all these concepts, they sound nice in theory. But once you have a bias, such as an individual bias, whose life am I valuing? Well, if it's a theoretical person, that's one thing. But if it's my life, that's something different. If it's the life of someone I know, suddenly it's something different. So, for example, there's a famous story of in the 80s, baby Jessica, young girl, falls into a well. Millions of dollars were raised to rescue baby Jessica McClure. None of that money needed to be raised. There wasn't a lack of money, yet the money came pouring in. She's well in her 30s now. The money was hers. Now, it's great that so much of America was concerned about baby Jessica, but that same money could have saved thousands of other people's lives. It was a choice and allocation. And the individual who was at risk, baby Jessica, was known. People could empathize with her. The millions who perhaps are starving around the world, people don't know them that well. It's difficult to empathize. So all these biases play into it.
Thank you, Howard. One other thing that kind of blends a couple of points that you just mentioned in that response, in terms of effective altruism. So if you think about extending the book maybe one more chapter, one listener asks, what are your general thoughts on the effective altruism community, which tries to save or improve lives in the most cost-effective manner? So here you're sort of blending the notion of improving and saving lives, but doing it in the most cost-effective or cost-efficient, realizing those are different way. Do you have any comments on that or thoughts?
I mean, my first thought is if the book goes into a second edition, I think the extra chapter would be on COVID. But maybe if I had two extra chapters, one would be on COVID and one will be on effective altruism. I think it's a great point, right? Because people who are donating, they're donating, they have passion around a cause. They want to use money to make a positive difference. And then you just have to ask yourself, well, what's the metric that I'm looking at? It's nice when you have these things that are all on the same scale. So let me throw out two technical terms for the audience for a second. Cost effectiveness and cost benefit. Cost effectiveness is how much money am I spending for an outcome? So if it's education, it might be how much money am I spending per graduate? If it's health, maybe it's how much money am I spending per life saved? Cost benefit puts everything in a dollar. If I'm saving a life, I put $1 on that life. If it's education, I put $1 on that education. The nice thing about cost benefit is everything is now measured in the same unit. You may not like how I monetized it, but I do think that there's a real opportunity for effective altruism. And maybe there's a way to modify the tax law at some point so that if there is some measure of effective altruism, money given to one cause perhaps has a higher return than money given to another cause, then maybe that's a way to also impact the tax system as well. But I think it's a great opportunity to open up and to really see what is the highest return on investment. Over.
Thanks, Howard. Let me just ask you a couple of questions here as we start to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. Again, I welcome our listeners to by all means add anything else or send me any additional chats. You did a lot of research for this book, as you have in your other texts. What was the big surprise to you? What did you learn from all this? We've obviously learned a ton from you in this brief interview this evening, but what was the big eye-opener here? You've seen a lot of data, U.S. and otherwise. What's the big surprise for you in all of this?
I mean, for me, I think it was the tremendous disparity. I've studied this for a while. I had a previous book, Measure of a Nation, that even focused on inequality. But when I started digging into the specific question about human life is worth, the ranges is what started to shock me, because that's when you start really realizing the tremendous range in income, the range in punishments in civil courts, the ranges in criminal courts for punishments. Some people get convicted and they get, time served. Others go to jail for 20 years. So the ranges is what I think really surprised me. And I think that's something where it really triggers my point about start with equality, don't start with income. Because when you start with income, it drives this tremendous range, which intrinsically to me not only seems unfair, but the ramifications are very clear. And the case in point that I showed in the slides earlier was comparing Bhopal, India, and the $60,000 versus the more than $20 million per life of the recent Toyota acceleration case. That range plays all the role in how people's lives are protected.
I must say, that's an excellent point. If I just add just my own little personal observation here, I think I'm going to remember the number 30x because having, like most of us who lived through the 9/11 events, especially here locally, I lived in the city at the time. I never knew 30x was the range until I read your book. So that number is going to stick with me. And we appreciate your views, obviously, on a variety of topics here. Let me ask you the following final question before I give it back to John. Again, if you're not looking at the chat box, please do. John's been kind enough to send out the link. So if you want to pick up Howard's book straight from McNally Jackson, by all means, there's a link there. You can click right on it and go over. Last question to you, Dr. Friedman, is the following. What's next? You've talked about inequality. Now you've talked about, in terms of measure of a nation, now you've talked about the price of a life. What's next on the radar? What can we expect to see from you next?
If it was a TV commercial, I think they would say I'm going to Disney World. But in my particular case, I think I like communicating to a lay audience. I mean, I publish for scientists as well, and it's a different conversation. But I love writing for a lay audience, and I'd like to write more about data science for young audiences, and for regular folks, so they understand what is this buzzword? What is this buzzword AI and machine learning, and what does it mean for me? Because it's an interesting topic. It's something that's shaping our lives every single day. And I think the general approach that I like to take is the more we're aware of something, the more we can understand how it can benefit us and also the risks involved. So I'm really looking to head more down that road, and hopefully I'll have something soon on that. I do want to pause, as we're at the latter part, to thank Professor Paul Thurman for a fantastic job as a moderator. I really appreciate it. And to thank McNally Jackson for the opportunity. I used to live about a block and a half from your store on Prince Street, and it was really one of my favorite hangout places. So it's a thrill to be hosted by what is truly probably one of my favorite bookstores in the world. So over to you.